You'll be surprised to know that all this while the rights were that only of a daughter, of a wife, and there was no concept of a partner, as we call it, in a living relationship. So, the 2006 Act of the Prevention of Domestic Violence Against Women, for the first time, recognized the the importance of protecting a woman in a relationship, which is a live-in relationship, where she's not a wife, but she's still a partner, and she could be at the receiving end of an abuse.
Oh.
So the abuse could be financial abuse, like it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be mental. So a woman who is not a wife but is a partner is one who is taken care of under this act. Rape, as is defined under the Indian Penal Code, is a rape against the wish of the woman. But the exception is the marriage. So it is by presumption that there is a consent. I know of a couple where the wife was involved in an extramarital relationship. The husband had all the evidences against her. He put that tracker in her car and he followed her, and they went to some kind of a place which was a hotel and etc. etc. He went and filed a case, and then it went on for a year and a half, and the case was going. So we had a couple of meetings, and you'll be surprised to know that at the end of those two meetings, the parties reconciled. And they realized, yes, so what? So what if the wife is, it's not right morally, legally, in every which way. But that doesn't mean the family is destroyed.
Welcome to Perception and Beyond, the podcast that dives deep into the ideas, identities, and legal realities that shape how we see the world and how the world sees us. In this powerful episode, we address a subject that affects millions of women but is rarely talked about with clarity: women's legal rights in India. Joining us is Ms. Mrinalini Deshmukh, one of India's most respected voices in matrimonial law, women's rights advocacy, and family law litigation. We'll be busting common myths around divorce law, domestic violence protections, child custody, alimony, and property rights for women, while shining a light on the legal tools every woman should know. Whether you are navigating a difficult marriage, considering separation, or simply want to be more informed, this episode is your legal guide to empowerment. Let's get into the truths that every woman, married or unmarried, has the right to hear. Hi, Ms. Deshmukh. Welcome to Perception and Beyond. So I would like to know that what are the most commonly misunderstood rights of every Indian woman, whether it is a married woman or an unmarried lady, that every woman should know. And these are misunderstood rights, but everybody should be aware of.
So, hello, and thank you so much for having me over here. It's going to be a pleasure interacting with you and discussing these issues. I think the question that you have put up about what are the things that women need to know and what are the things that they don't know is a very wide question. And the reason I'm saying that it's a wide question is because there are different facets of one's life where a man and a woman both have rights. And this is enshrined in the Constitution of India, and which is the base document from which all the other acts and enactments are coming out. So, and particularly speaking about the women's rights, I can give you, if I can just take a minute and educate our audiences, that's been a long struggle right from the time of the framing of the Constitution as we speak today in 2025. And it's been a long struggle not only for women, but it has been a long struggle even for legislation and for the legislators and for the framers of the Constitution to do that. An interesting part to which I think most of us, we know we have fundamental rights. Right. We know there's right to equality. We know there's no discrimination between, on the grounds of gender. Correct. And so on and so forth. But the same section or the same clause of the article of the Constitution says nothing will stop the state from making special laws for women and children. And that is the key word, because even at the time when equality was said, the legislation felt that, or the constitution makers felt, that to be able to bring about genuine equality between men and women, the status of the women which then existed had to be a little elevated. True. And that only then, if they are on par, that you can have equality. So an effort has gone into just elevating the status of the women with the help of the different rights. So you have rights which are there in your safety, security, in terms of, you have right of privacy, you have a right of safety and security. You also have rights in terms of your marriage within the four walls of your home, or the room as we call it. You have rights with the workplace, and I'll come to the different laws a little later. You have rights as a girl being born in the family, in terms of inheritance, in terms of what would be sort of given to her equally, which is now equally, not then, so that there is a meaningful and equal equation between a boy and a girl in the family. And lastly, and more importantly, in cases of marriage, divorce, etc., what is it the right for women? And you see, most of the women spend 2 decades, 3 decades in a marriage. And I mean, at the end of it, they are left so, I mean, they are all alone. They don't know how to face the world.
Right.
You need money. You need a lot of social acceptance, which now has come over a period of time. And you also need money at the end of the day, because you have to survive. And if you have a child, which you have to take care of, then at least there are 2 people, that is you and the child, or if there's more than one child. And what are the rights of, in the eyes of law, as far as such women and the children born are there? So it's a very wide gamut of things.
Absolutely.
And I think as we progress in our discussion, I'll be able to decipher that, and we'll be able to sort of, throw a little more light on it.
Certainly. And this lack of legal awareness, how does it impact the self-image and self-confidence of a lady, especially when she's not aware of her rights and the legalities which get involved, especially when it comes to her own fundamental rights?
So that's a very important question, and may not be so much for you and me who are living in urban metros. True. But the women who stay in tier 2, tier 3 kind of places in India, there is a lot of uncertainty or ignorance in some cases, or a little warped way of doing that. What happens? Is she always at the receiving end? Well, is it fate for her, or is there a way out and it's not end of the road, and there is something that she can look forward to? There's something that she can, take her charge of her life and move on. So these are the things, and so ignorance and all these things are there, but the most important thing is the awareness that has to be brought about. So I'll give you a very simple example. Let's not talk at a very generic level or at a macro level. For example, let's say a friend of yours or mine has got a problem in her marriage, and there is abuse. Now, abuse in law is not only physical abuse, it means violence, it means mental violence, emotional violence, financial violence. The husband is not giving her money, or whatever the case may be. So the first thing that she has to do is to take a proper legal advice. That what are the remedies available for her, not action, advice. There's no point in acting on it without having a proper advice. That advice will tell her that what are her rights, and that will help her to go to the proper forum or the forums to exercise her rights as a woman who is in distress, or who needs financial help, or who is at the receiving end in the hands of her husband or her in-laws. So awareness comes from vigilance.
Right.
We have to understand one thing, that every person, is very, very important for us to be very vigilant about our rights, because at the same time, all of us have, and women have more intuitive power. The moment you realize that there's something which is going wrong with me, and this wrong is something which is not justified, you must be vigilant about it, and you must try and explore what can be the best. I never recommend that you break families. I don't recommend that you just rush to courts and lawyers and police stations and all. But your awareness is very important. And the other person, if you are the abuser and if I am the receiving end, you should know that, listen, buddy, I know what my rights are. I may not go to that extent, because I don't want to destroy a family. I don't want to upset the whole apple cart. but I know what it is. This itself is a good thing for the abuser to know that the woman is aware of it.
And I think awareness also brings a lot of empowerment.
Yes.
Especially in a toxic relationship when you may or may not want to take the next step. But
Right.
at least when you go to the right person and take proper advice, you know where you stand.
Right.
And what is in it for you when it comes to taking the next step, if ever you decide to do that, whether it's your rights or the rights of your children, at least you are absolutely aware of, what's
Absolutely.
required.
This is what they say, knowledge is power. So when you say knowledge is power, awareness is a part of knowledge. And the moment you realize that this is what needs to be done. And that's why I said, vigilance is very important. With vigilance comes awareness. With vigilance comes, from awareness comes the power to deal with the situation in a more effective manner. So you could take help of the different agencies which are available. Sometimes you have NGOs which help you. Sometimes you have cops who help you. Sometimes you have families who may help you. And then, of course, courts and things are there as a last resort. So these are all stepping stones before coming to a court of law to get these things done. So yes, you are right. Awareness is empowerment.
But Ms. Deshmukh, if somebody is not sure who to go to, if they are in such a relationship or they have any kind of a concern, who are the right people who they can approach? Like maybe they have, or a lady has an apprehension that maybe a lawyer will exploit or misuse the information. There could be a possibility like that as well.
Sure, and it could be a genuine concern.
Yes. So then how do they find out that who's the right person? Maybe they want to do these things discreetly and they don't want to talk about it to the relatives.
I think it's a very important and very pertinent question, because this is something most of, or some of the women would be in a dilemma in the event that they are in such a situation. I think the best thing for them would be if the closest or some kind of a Mahila organization or an NGO or some kind of a things which deals with these sort of issues, which will give you only a basic knowledge. They are not lawyers, they are
Correct.
not cops, they are not authorities, but at least a basic knowledge is given, a little basic guidance is given. And then sometimes they have their own panel of lawyers also who are doing probably pro bono cases, or some of them who are doing the work of advising and consulting, and actual cases go to another lawyer. So these are all permutation combinations that they have. But yes, to answer your question, it has to be someone who is an organization which is a non-profit organization doing it for a cause, and maybe in this case for the women's cause.
Is alimony automatically granted to women who are going through these divorce cases, or there are certain terms and conditions that get associated?
Alimony is it's an offshoot of a divorce. And this is the right of a woman who has invested, say, X number of years in a marriage. So alimony, there are different standards which have been set out by the courts. If you ask me, is there any percentage that is there in the statutes as we speak today? The answer is no. But it has come over judicial sort of, interpretations and precedents which have come over. The law, our laws of divorce and things are based on the English Matrimonial Causes Act. So there the percentage was sometimes 1/3 to 1/5 of the net worth of the husband. But again, as I said, this is a very vague way of putting it. The courts do apply their own mind. They look at the facts and circumstances. So what are normally the factors that the courts consider? Why should a court give an X amount as an alimony? So they have to look at the income of the applicant. The wife, applicant is the wife. Whether she has any income. Sufficient, insufficient, that is her husband's income. The dependence that the husband has, the standard of living that the parties have lived, and the number of years that have been invested in the marriage. Also, whether there are any joint investments or whether there are any joint movable, immovable assets, etc. All these factors are considered by the court, and at times the age of the parties. Because the younger you are, there are better chances of you resettling. But say you have invested 25, 30 years of your marriage, and then you're at the fag and say you're 55 and 60. I'm not saying zero, but very less chances of you restarting your life. So under such circumstances, the courts are a little more kinder to such people, because then they're in the evening of their life and they need to be taken care of in a proper manner.
But Ms. Deshmukh, do you also come across such cases where people have spent 25, 30 years together and then going for separation or divorce?
Oh, yes. I don't know whether you're aware of this concept of calling grey divorces. Grey. So when you grey, so the word comes from the word grey. Nowadays, of course, we all color our hair. The concept is coming from the word grey. So when you grey, so when do you grey? Normally after 45, 50. Now, if you take an average Indian birth, gets married in little late 20. So maybe 15, 20 years of marriage. Kids are probably, 10, 15 or something in that range. And the sheen of the marriage goes away. And, or there is a third person in the marriage, or there is abuse which the woman has been suffering. I mean, I know a couple of cases where the woman was suffering and she got the child very soon, within a year or two of her marriage, and she was subjected to abuse, not physical, but in a way very emotional abuse for several years. But she stayed in the marriage for the child. When she knew the child was a little more independent, so he was around 14, and then he had to go to the university in a couple of years or something, then she took the decision of doing. By which time she had spent around 15, 20 years of her life doing that. So this concept of grey divorces have also been very popular. Earlier it was in the West, but we have so many even in India, where people take charge of their life when they are, say maybe closer to 50 or a little before that, and they want to now say that, okay, I've done my duties, I've done this, now I want to go on with my life. So this concept is also there. So in such cases, the courts are going to give them a kinder sort of allowance or the alimony, because they have invested so many. It's just like, it sounds very strange, but it's like any markets. You invest so much, you get so much of returns. So long-term investments, you get long-term return. So these are the factors that the courts consider.
What is the system, or what is the process of taking any kind of help, a pro bono help, for a lady who is not financially sound, especially in a relationship where she wants to get out, but she doesn't know how to go about it, primarily because she doesn't have money?
Have the funds, yeah. It's a very, very common thing that is happening. And there are many women, in fact, unfortunately, who continue to suffer in silence in relationship because they don't know what to do. Sometimes the parental family says, no. What, I mean, how can you even think about taking a divorce or talking about such things and all? So there's no question of them giving them a financial help. Whilst there is this woman who feels so trapped into this whole situation, and she wants an out. So there are these NGOs, as I said. Also in courts, we have what is known as legal aid, free legal aid. So in matrimonial courts, especially in, say, like in Mumbai and some other case, we have a concept of pre-litigation mediation. So a woman is troubled. She doesn't want to get into litigation because she does not have the wherewithal, or she doesn't want to make it so ugly, but she wants a mediation. But not mediation by somebody who are friends and family, but by an agency which is appointed by the government. So in such cases also, a woman can approach, and it's close to pro bono, very, very minimal fee which is required, but also get advice from and mediation from seasoned lawyers or seasoned retired high court judges, etc., who give them the direction.
So according to you, Ms. Deshmukh, what are the most common kind of abuses in a relationship because of which women decide to walk out of the marriage?
So in fact, it's not only common, but has now been articulated in the Act also. So I'll just give an example. We always talk about domestic violence. Now, what is domestic violence? I mean, it's a concept where violence is normally associated with a physical abuse. So the Act, which is the Protection of Women from the Domestic Violence Act of 2006, came in force in 2006. And the Act has defined what is domestic violence, which includes physical violence, which includes mental violence, and I'll just explain this to you with examples, which includes financial violence, and which includes emotional violence. Now, what is emotional violence? Now, let's start from the bottom. Emotional violence is when a woman is, criticized, she is ridiculed, you're good for nothing, you're just made to feel very worthless. Or there are cases where a husband is having an affair, or there's a third person in the marriage, and she said that, oh, if you don't accept this, you just have to, you walk out, you do what you want, I'm not going to take care of you, and I want to go on with this. So this is an emotional violence. So this violence is not causing her bruises, but it's really, really causing her a lot of pain, anguish, because, it scars her to see this kind of a thing. So these are emotional violence. Sometimes in these urban metros, we also get these cases where a woman gets ready and she's going for work, and the husband is a very, very sadistic person, and he say, "Oh, you're getting ready, you're getting dressed up. So sure, you're going to impress your boss, you're going to impress your male colleagues, and that's the reason why you're taking." No, I mean, I just want to look presentable, and because you're a part of this. So I thought I'll just make it. So, and this is how, if somebody says it once in a way, okay, there's anger, there's something, but continuously is happening. I mean, no person of self-worth will like to do that. So that comes into mental and emotional abusing. So I may not hurt you, but I will use the worst language. Run you down, run your family down, run everything that's close to you. That's also mental. And of course, financial violence is that violence where I just close the taps of money. You're dependent on me monetarily. I just don't give you money. You either do what I'm saying, or survive in this amount, or just go and fly a kite. So that is a financial abuse. So these different kinds of abuses have featured in the Act, and the courts have taken a practical view of it, and not just something which is a physical abuse is very sort of, as the word itself suggests, there is hurt, there is grievous hurt, or there is some kind of a hurt which is happening. And these are the things that the courts and the Act takes care of, and gives it a relief to the women concerned. Sometimes the husband says, "I'll throw you out of the house." Now where does the girl go? Her right to stay in a matrimonial home is an inherent right that she gets at the time when she gets married.
True.
This is protected by the Act. So that a woman can get a restraining order from the court preventing her husband or her relatives or his relatives, whoever are concerned, from evicting her or not letting her live there peacefully, or causing any kind of harassment to her while she's in the house.
I think legal battles can be very ugly, and they can go to any extent.
Absolutely.
In fact, in the last 3 days, I've been hearing and reading a lot about pregnant women getting abandoned by husbands. So what is the right that they can exercise, especially if they are like 5 months, 6 months pregnant, and they have been told that you need to leave the house? So does the right of the child is also secured, or they don't have any right?
So, I mean, there are reasons why people want a pregnant woman to be abandoned. So they could be that this is some kind of a pregnancy that they did want a child and the woman wants to continue. There could be some situations where there is a third person in the marriage and they don't want to get about it, and they're so consumed by their own self,
Right.
and it's only about I, me, myself, and not about what. And lastly, no responsibilities. You just want to be, footloose, fancy free, and do what you want, and things like that. So when you abandon a pregnant woman, suppose, let us say she is well within in her first trimester, where probably medical termination is permitted by law and by the doctors also. Now, in such cases, she has a right to choose what she wants. Sometimes when such women leave the house and they do abort the child because they said, my future is so uncertain, I mean, what am I going to get, some child which is there? Then the husbands also rake up this issue and go to the court of law and
Right.
find out from them and say, how dare she do that? That's also my child. It's not something that's hers. So there are various issues to the whole thing. So abandonment of a pregnant woman can be for various issues, and is also the worst kind of a torture that a lady can go through.
Correct. So, Ms. Deshmukh, usually in custody battles, it's often assumed that the women will always get the right of a child. So, to what extent is this statement true? And you think that this is like a birthright of every lady, that they or she rather would get the baby, or there is a different version to that?
So legally, if you ask me what are the rights of custody rights, the courts, the guiding principle is, or the parameters that they use, is the best interest and welfare of the child. So they use that, and not the right of a father or the right of a mother.
Right.
So normally the law says that till the age of 5, because for obvious reasons, the mother is a better guardian. But that doesn't automatically make after 6 the father the guardian. So again, they're going to say, what is the best interest of the child? What is in the best interest of the child? That has to be. What is the best interest? The environment, the kind of nourishment that the child is going to get. Sometimes the finances. But that doesn't mean that if a woman doesn't have finances, she doesn't get the custody. The courts will say, no, nothing doing. She's a good mother. She can take better care, and you better provide for the wife and for the child. So financial is one part of it. And lastly, what kind of upbringing that you can give to the child are the factors that the courts take into consideration. So the physical welfare, the emotional welfare, the financial welfare, and the futuristic welfare of the child. So when you say that, is it always that in custody cases the mothers get? The concept is now changing. Oh. In fact, today's concept, and this is what we have as lawyers also brought about, because we are also officers of the court and judicial thinkers, we have brought about the concept of what is known as joint custody and joint legal guardianship and joint parental care. So a child could be with a mother, but the child is not, a father is not just going to come on a Sunday and give him gifts and have lunch and go away. He's going to be involved with the child in his education, in his schooling, typically your PTAs and things which are there, in the concerts, in sports, tuitions, extracurricular classes, besides paying for the expenses. So the child, according to the courts, get the benefit. Unfortunately, he's a victim of a separation, but to a large extent get the benefit of both the parents working for it.
Which also means that this is dual parenting.
Yes.
But at the same time, they live separately.
Yeah, because they can't get along. So
Correct.
They obviously... So like I always say in all my interviews, that if you ever ask a child, you want to be with the mother or your dad, and they always say with both of them. So no child, under extreme circumstances, it may be in some cases that he may say, I want mother. Because the child wants both the parents.
Right.
He or she is just an innocent victim of the things which are there.
So has there been any kind of case study where usually we always hear that the divorces are always ugly? But has there been any kind of mutual or dual parenting where there has been a divorce, but the maturity level is so good that the parents have decided to co-parent the child?
Of course. There are so many cases we are doing. And I think that's where probably a seasoned lawyer or someone who's got a little experience behind him or her would be useful. Because we tell the parents, your children are there with you for the next 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, whatever. Then they're just going to fly away from. Just give them the best of what it is. Because we don't want children to be scarred by seeing the toxic environment in the house. We don't want the children to be scarred to see the fights that are going on. They want to see that, okay, my mom and dad live separate, but both mom and dad together take care of me. In fact, I'll tell you, you'll be surprised to know that we also recommend, even after divorce, the husband, wife, and the child or the children have 1 annual holiday.
Right.
So the husband may, after divorce, the husband may have remarried, or he may have a partner. She may have remarried, or she may have a partner. But no partners come. The man, the woman, that is, let's call them ex-husband, the parents of the child and the child or the children go on an annual vacation for a week or so that the child knows that, they would be, of course, in separate rooms, and there may not be the greatest of the communication, but at least the child has a make-believe situation that, my family is with me.
But have you seen such cases where people have made an attempt to do that?
We draw up the terms. I have done in my cases.
Wow.
And I have advised them. Because, see, ultimately, as a lawyers, we are law officers also. We are officers of the court. We owe it to the kids, not to the adult client who comes to us.
True.
We owe it to the kids. And that's the least that one can do.
Absolutely. So even after reforms, many daughters, now we are talking about the ancestral property. So I think majority of the time, women or the daughters are not aware of their rights in the ancestral property, which is the father's property or the family property. So what are the legal rights of a daughter in a family like that?
So the law has undergone a lot of changes. Initially, so now just to take typically a Hindu family. So the ancestral property is there. What is known as co-partners. Co-partners are parties of the family. There were only a male who was born could be a co-partner. So only he was entitled those days for the uncodified law. Only he was entitled to inherit from his great grandfather or grandfather, etc. as the case may
Sorry,
be.
I'm just interrupting here. But ancestral property होती क्या है? सबसे पहले I think वो define करना is very important.
Yeah, so I'll come to that. I'll just define that. Ancestral property is that property which is 3 generations above and belongs to them.
Okay.
And it has come. It's not your grandfather's property. It is grandfather's father's, great grandfather as you call it, his property. But that is also to be seen whether it has come down as ancestral or whether it has come by way of a will and inheritance. Because if it comes down by will and inheritance, then that becomes a self-acquired property. Then that doesn't necessarily become a ancestral property. But if it is come by inheritance in that sense of the word, that by default from A it goes to B and B to C and so on and so forth, then that is ancestral property where the children can stake a claim. So to answer your earlier question, women did not have rights into it prior to that. In fact, women did not have rights to even own a property. It was you even if you had the money, the property was not bought in your name. It was bought in the name of your husband, it was bought in the name of your son, things like that. Of course, the law has changed now, and today the Hindu Succession Act, which otherwise did not consider a birth of a child in the family as to be a co-partner, has now not only made her a co-partner, she can be the karta of the family, she could be the head of the family unit as they call it, and she could also decide about things which are there, even taking responsibilities of the family. So when we say that, in fact, just a related question, you see a lot of people where some parents are abandoned by their children, at their old age.
Correct.
Earlier it was a son has to take care. But today the law is that as much as rights are given to the women in their properties, in their assets, as by birth, etc., also the responsibility is given on them. That God forbid your parents are abandoned, or God forbid your parents are in dire need of, physical assistance, financial assistance, medical assistance. A girl has to equally contribute if she has the wherewithals for the child or for the parents.
Oh, okay.
So rights and duties always go hand in hand. So it just cannot be my rights. These are also my duties which are there.
Absolutely, absolutely. A woman only needs to think about finances after marriage. What proactive legal or financial steps should every woman take before and after marriage? So this is something which is very important, and especially to protect her own independence.
So first and foremost, I think the moment a woman becomes major or starts earning, she should take charge of her finances. And surely before marriage. Number one. Number two, my advice is to all women who are there, please be financially independent before you venture into marriage.
I think before independence, be financially aware.
Even financially independent.
Yes.
You walk into a relationship with equality, not on dependency.
True.
You may not be earning too much, but there's something which this is mine. This is what my secret. In fact, I can tell you, I had attended a conference in Delhi, and this was the issue that were brought up. And typical Delhi culture, North culture was that they spend so much on the girl's wedding, they spend crores and crores of rupees, and they do that. So I was speaking to them, one such question came to me, and I told all the audiences which were there that I said, you please take care of it. If you are going to spend, say, 5 crores for your daughter's wedding, only spend 1 or 1.5. Rest, keep in investment for her. Because tomorrow, God forbid something happens, she doesn't have to be dependent on her husband. What is the point in just having this big fat Indian wedding, blowing up the money, and then coming and fighting for it and saying that, oh, they have taken so much of jewelry, they've taken so much of this, and my daughter is left in, So today, parents have to ensure, especially the parents of the girl, have to ensure that their girl is financially protected. They may not pass over everything to her, but there could be things could be kept in for her. So she has that right. She has that dignity. And God forbid a situation arises where she's really driven up the wall, to step out of the house and not be dependent on. But that's one thing that we have suggested. The awareness that comes is that you have to be aware of what is yours and take care of that. The awareness a little bit is also about what could be the earnings of your husband. But I'll tell you something, it's such a very touchy thing in our kind of society. It's not so transactional as it is in, say, overseas or things like that. We rarely get into how much you earn, how much I earn, and kind of a situation. Things are okay. But there's nothing wrong in getting those kind of information, not for want of any greed or anything, but only for the sake of awareness. Thirdly, and more importantly, at the time when you get married, you have to be very clear, and there has to be demarcation of your duties and what your entitlements are. I'm not talking this should be a document or an agreement, but this understanding is going to help you to sort of, be a little more aware of what the things are.
I think very commonly what I have seen with most families is that even if you are very sound financially, like the family is very sound, the focus is children, that unke upar sab investment karna hai, for their future, for their marriage. But nobody actually puts the lens on the lady of the house when it comes to investing, as savings or, something for the future. So the entire focus goes on children.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether it is insurance, whether it is XYZ,
absolutely,
anything.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why it goes also because they are minors and they're dependents and things like that. And classically, and if you see traditionally, a husband is supposed to take care of the wife.
Yeah.
So क्यों करना investment? I'm there to take care of you.
और मैं हूँ तुम्हारा investment.
बस और क्या चाहिए? Absolutely.
So I think that's a very stereotypical mindset where people, especially the lady of the house, needs to be vocal about the fact that if you are making an investment, I am also there. So you have to think about me also, my future. God forbid if there is any unforeseen circumstances that arise all of a sudden, and where will I go?
But most people don't do. You're very right. Husbands, they create, मैं हूँ now that kind of a situation. I'm there to take care of you. Why do I need to invest for you or in your name? Some of them do that, especially when they buy apartments in places like this, where or homes, because they want to create that security that God forbid something happens to them. At least there is a roof over the head, which is the most important thing. But yes, in terms of investments, there are very few who want to, unless they want to sort of, distribute their assets in a manner, the portfolios in a manner where it's tax efficient. And that is why. So, oft repeated question comes. A house stands in the name of husband and wife. Okay? The wife has not contributed anything. She's not paid a penny for it.
Right.
Tomorrow, if they go for a divorce, what are her rights? Are her rights because it's in the joint names? Are her rights because her name is on the share certificate? Or her rights because she's a wife? Or there are no rights because she's not contributed anything? So these are the questions which the courts deal with. So the courts are dealing with a financial contribution of the wife, whether it's there or not, the extent to which it is there, or if not there, zero. The rights of a wife vis-a-vis her rights into a matrimonial home, and what are the repercussions of that. So this is what the courts have to look at it when they decide these rights, and not any, straightforward way of saying that, okay, 50% is yours. The house is worth, say, 5 crores, 50% is yours. It doesn't happen like this.
So how does the math work in such situations?
So the math works, again, as I come back to those factors, the number of years invested, the age of the parties, and the likelihood of them moving on or not moving on because of certain factors. And of course, as I said, if there is some contribution by the wife also, that gives her an added advantage. She may have contributed only 10%, may not be more than that. But Those are the factors that the courts take into consideration. So they may not be able to give you exactly 50%, which is say 2.5 crores, but somewhere close to that because of the other rights and despite no financial contributions. That's how they do.
So every time the math varies depending upon the situation.
Again, as they say, facts and circumstances
Correct.
of the case.
For
Every
example,
case.
if there is a man who is in extramarital affair,
Yeah.
and if it is proven, and even though the wife has not invested in the joint property, there may be a difference in terms of rights.
This Domestic Violence Act, which I was talking about, is one of the acts, and of course it was there in the other matrimonial thing. The first right that she gets, because normally what happens is if the house stands in the name of the husband or the wife, even if it's in the joint name, the first year husband says, just get out of the house.
Right.
Just get out, nikal jao kind of stuff. So these are the kind of women who can go to the domestic violence court and take an order from the court that I should not be thrown out of the house, I cannot be dispossessed unless by due process of law, and that he cannot sell the apartment till such time that my rights are sort of carved out in this. So those are the reliefs that you get.
You know, we also get to hear a very different version these days. Although on prima facie, when you look at certain things, it looks like a woman is the victim. But sometimes the situation is a very different situation where, you know, they play a victim card. I'm saying something which is totally different.
Yes.
Where, you know, a man could actually be the victim.
Yes.
But the projection is that I am the victim card. I am playing the victim card because this is my circumstances. But, you know, the story is totally different altogether.
So today, unfortunately, in some cases, there has been a lot of abuse of the laws. And this abuse of the laws are really creating a lot of sort of, you know, maze in the judiciary also, because the courts are not able to understand.
Right.
They feel this is a law made for the protection of the woman. But is the woman really using that law for the right purpose and to get justice? Or is she using this as a weapon of destroying and a vengeance and, you know, sort of breakup of the entire. So that is where the difficulty arises. So again, when we are talking about rights and execution of the rights and courts coming to the help of the woman to get her rights, they have to now decipher this. And they have to sort of, you know, see from, as they say, from the wheat from the chaff and see what is the genuine case. But generally the optics, and again I'm using the word optics, is that the woman is at the receiving end in most cases. And that's what the impressions the courts also carry.
And how easy or difficult is it to manipulate the judicial system?
No, that I will not be able to answer. What can be done is you can mislead the courts.
Yes.
You in a sense, a litigant through his lawyer. And that is where you need lawyers with integrity and all. Because lawyers are, remember, the officers of the court. They are an extension of the court. They don't decide the case, but they are part of the system. So you cannot mislead the courts. The courts can only give justice if the correct and appropriate facts are kept before it. So this is the way the judicial system could be sort of, you know, as they call it, interference in the administration of justice can happen in such cases.
Ms. Deshmukh, what is a prenuptial agreement? Because we've always heard of this, especially from the Western concept. But is it valid in India as well? And if it is, then how does one go about it?
So I'll go a little behind before I answer this question. Why are we हम लोग prenup की चर्चा क्यों कर रहे हैं आज की तारीख में? Why are we discussing this? We are discussing this because we are seeing what's happening in society. We are discussing this because we are seeing what is happening in courts. We are discussing because we are seeing what's happening in families. So today, young boys do not want to get into this rigmarole that, okay, 3 years, 4 years, the relationship continues. Then my wife will go to the court. She'll file cases against me. She'll ask a share in my property. She'll not only stop there, she'll try and ask share in my father's properties or grandfather's properties or things maybe. So there is this fear in their mind. एक डर बैठ गया है कि शादी तो हम करना चाहते हैं, हमको family चाहिए. We want to move on in a very structured manner. Not that we want to be anything different. But there are so many pitfalls that are there. How do I protect myself and my family as well? God willing, everything is fine, hunky dory, what is mine is going to be hers. But agar kuch nahi hua, so I don't want to lose my wife and also lose my money. So today, in fact, I see a large section of people, especially parents, parents coming from well-to-do backgrounds, where their own children have a lot of wealth, or they're likely to inherit a lot of wealth, who come to me for these prenup advices prior to marriage. Like they'll say, ma'am, this is my daughter, we come from a particular background, there's enough wealth we have, and she's getting married to someone XYZ, he could be a Farang, he could be somebody else. And we have a fear that this may or may not last. But what happens? How do I protect the assets? How do I protect the wealth of my daughter so that she's able to sort of, we don't have to. So that's when we say that if both the parties are agreeable, enter into what is known as a memorandum of understanding, which is similar to prenup, but which is not exactly prenup. Now, you asked a very valid question. Is it an acceptable or is it an executable document in a court of law? Answer is, as we speak, no. But the understanding which is captured in the document becomes the intent of the parties at the time when the divorce is granted.
Okay.
So that becomes a guideline for them to be able to sort of, okay, that's what the understanding was. So it may not be exactly the execution of that, but something close to that. Even if that is achieved, I'll tell you, half the problems will be solved.
So, Ms. Deshmukh, this is a very important question that I want to ask you about live-in relationships, because a large part of society, especially the younger generation, are moving into the live-in relationships now. So, in that aspect, how do women or girls today exercise their rights, especially when it comes to any kind of abuse or any kind of violence? So suppose if they experience something like this, then what is the next obvious step that they should take?
So, you'll be surprised to know that all this while the rights were that only of a daughter, of a wife, and there was no concept of a partner, as we call it, in a live-in relationship. So the 2006 Act of the Prevention of Domestic Violence Against Women, for the first time, recognized the importance of protecting a woman in a relationship, which is a live-in relationship, where she's not a wife, but she's still a partner, and she could be at the receiving end of an abuse.
Oh.
So the abuse could be financial abuse, it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be mental. So a woman who is not a wife, but is a partner, is one who is taken care of under this act.
Another thing I want to ask you is about the most common thing that happens in a marriage is marital rape. But this is a very, very common phenomenon. And I'm sure as a very senior lawyer in the system in India, you must have come across many such cases where I don't know if women are vocal about it now, because earlier I know that people were not very vocal and they would not voice out such concern. But what is the situation today when it comes to marital law, and how do they exercise their right in that?
So let me explain to you. Rape, as is defined under the Indian Penal Code, is a rape against the wish of the woman. But the exception is in a marriage. So it is by presumption that there is a consent, but which is not true. There can be several cases where women do not want to consent to it, where women have their own reservations, which could be physical concerns, which could be emotional concerns. I mean, you can't have a man who's abusing you the whole day, just running you down, and then in the night coming and say, come on, you're not some kind of a commodity or object to be done. But the law, as we speak, is not, marital rape is not the law of the land. However, there is a caveat that I want to put it. However, in cases like this, where there is forceful physical intimacy that is from the husband's side, which is much against the wife's side, can be construed as extreme cruelty to her. So if that forceful act results in her having physical pain or physical bruises or physical kind of things, then obviously it goes under that. But if it is also something which is causing her trauma or which is causing her a lot of grief and agony, that comes under emotional and mental violence. And the relief to these provisions are available under the Domestic Violence Act, whether you're a wife or whether you're a partner. So when you talk about marital rape, you're talking about a man and a woman who are legally married. But there could be rape even in a live-in relationship.
Yes.
Where there's a man and a woman, they are not married. So this law applies for them also.
So when a partner or a wife experiences any mental health disorder because of toxic relationship or some sort of abuse in marriage, is that also held against the man when there is a battle?
So it's a cumulative effect. Is the mental health issue which has been occurred to the woman, it could be depression, it could be any kind of mental health issue. Is it something that was always within her? She suffered from that, but it was never tapped or it was never spoken about it, or whether that is a reaction to what she has undergone. So that's when the doctors are going to be able to tell us. And if it is a reaction or if it is a fallout of the abuse that she has gone through, then obviously it would be, unless it was always there from the beginning.
When we talk about evidences in the court of law, is a WhatsApp message or a text message or a voice note or even an email considered as a strong legal evidence?
Yes. All of these, as you just mentioned, are considered as good evidences. They have under the law what is known as a 65B certificate. For example, I send you a WhatsApp message and I abuse you. Okay. So it has gone from my number, it has gone to your number. But you know what we see in courts, and I must tell you this, I leave my phone there. Okay. And somebody messages from my phone. Messages you, I don't even know about it. Suppose they have access. Suppose they know the passcode and they do it. So is it a legal evidence that I have sent you message? Because technically it's gone from my phone to your phone.
Right.
Technically my phone can be only accessed by me. So these are the different nuances that we get. So these are taken as an acceptable mode of evidences. They are something that the courts consider positively, but everything has its twists and turns.
Right. So for a woman who is facing any kind of trauma, be it any kind of violence or abuse, and she is very intimidated about the fact that if she has to consult or take legal advice, what is the very first step that this person or this lady should take?
Who wants to step out of the marriage?
Yes.
She has to first ensure her jewelry is with her.
Oh.
Please take possession of all your jewelry, because that's your right under the law. That's the stridhan, as we call it. Keep all your documents together. Don't just rush out in a fit of a rage. Keep all your, whatever your little bit of cash, your little bit of finances which are available, take that. If you're leaving with the child, then ensure that the child's medicals, academics, and other such stuff is there. The rest can be, so documents which are pertaining to that. The rest can be taken care of by the courts. But these are the basic things that you need to first take care of. And keep it either in a safe place, whom you trust, or if you have a bank locker, keep it in that, and then try and fight this out.
Wonderful. How accessible is a free legal aid for a lady who is wanting to take the first step?
Quite accessible. In today's times, in all courts at every stage, the free legal aid is available. And so honestly, the quality of the lawyers there may not be exactly up to the mark, to be very fair and honest. But it's not that there is no legal advice given. That is taken care of. And that is why they have this arm of the government also, which deals with free legal aid.
So, Ms. Deshmukh, can you share a case study where there was, I would say, infidelity? Maybe a high-profile case which you dealt with, and then, there was a divorce, maybe a divorce which was not so pleasant, but at the same time, when the separation happened, the child was also involved, and then how did the whole thing,
So I will give you a story which is different. And why? Because it's something, they say truth is stranger than fiction. So this would be footing that. I know of a couple where the wife was involved in an extramarital relationship The husband had all the evidences against her. He put that tracker in her car and he followed her, and they went to some kind of a place which was a hotel and etc. etc. He went and filed a case, and then it went on for a year and a half, and the case was going on. In between, I don't know, for some strange reason, the wife just approached me in a court whilst we were waiting for the matter to be called out. She's saying, "Can I talk to you?" I said, "Sure, I can talk to you." She's saying, "Is there something that we can sit together and sort it out? I don't want to get into all this." I said, "Sure, why not? Nobody's interested in, going down that route." So we had a couple of meetings, and you'll be surprised to know that at the end of those 2 meetings, the parties reconciled.
Oh.
And they realized, yes, so what? So what if the wife it's not right morally, legally, in every which way. But that doesn't mean the family is destroyed. So that maturity of the mind and can I tell you this with a lot of happiness and, I would say pride to that effect, because I was in a way instrumental for it, was that these people it's been around 10 years and they are together. They are so happy. The husband was critically ill. The wife did everything for him, literally dragged him from the jaws of the death. The children grown up, the children married, and every time at Diwali I get a big hamper. Thank you for showing us the right path.
Wow.
And I think this is so overwhelming for me that, we all commit mistakes. Nobody is God here. Everybody is human here. But how do you react and how do you see the larger picture? So this is one of the cases which I always sort of like to narrate with a lot of happiness and joy, rather than talking, because it's a typical thing that there's divorce, so there's an infidelity, then that ends up in a divorce, and there's a fight for money, and the husband saying, "Why should I pay the wife money? She's not been fair to me. She's been treacherous. She's been sort of, she's betrayed me." The wife says, "So what? I've been suffering at your hands for the last 15 years. So both have their own cases, and then it goes on, and sometimes it gets settled, or sometimes the courts come into the picture. But this case with the parties, despite knowledge and acceptance from both the sides that yes, she has committed adultery, and she never said, "Oh, no, I've not done it. It happened. I'm sorry. It shouldn't have happened. Maybe one of those weeks." And the husband came back, and they all stayed together.
So this also means that not every couple who goes to the court gets separated or divorced.
Absolutely. And that should be the first concern of the lawyers, of the judges, and of the whole system. Can we save the marriage? The first option is that. If it cannot be, then let's try and do it in an amicable way. And the last option, if both are not done, then the courts will decide.
So do you also get involved actively in counseling the couples where?
2000%.
Oh, wow.
In fact, with a little bit of my experience that I have, when a person starts narrating things, the first thing I say is, you do not need a divorce. You need only guidance and counseling. Please go to a counselor. If you have someone, well and good. If you need some advice, I can give you. Come back after 2-3 months. I'm sitting here. You can always come back. There's some who don't come back, and I'm so happy because they have overcome what their fears, their anxieties were. Some come back and say, "No, we want to do it." Then we say, "Okay, then let's start the process." So every lawyer has to first give a very, very candid view of the situation.
Wonderful. Okay, I want to ask you that, is it possible for you to share with us a very high-profile case where, the situation fell out of hand and then there was a very ugly battle?
So we had this case of a singer, a very well-known singer whose wife I was representing. And the singer was into alcohol. He was into fleecing the wife because she came from an extremely wealthy background. And he took a lot of money from her and made all those things and made her cry and made her really run from pillar to post because she was new to India and that was not her country. And that was one case which I took for her. And fortunately, with the right kind of advice and things were given, she was able to get out of that mess and that situation. And today, she's a much happier person where she is. So there are cases where this was a very high profile case. The man is very well known artist and singer. And, but what profile he had as as a media person or as an artist was not what he was at home. And he was a demon, and a demon of all sorts, I would say so, all sorts. And this is something because we had evidences and we were able to get, and the courts were there to guide her, to give her the justice that she get, especially because she was not from this country, but happened to live here by virtue of the marriage. So these are the cases that we deal with, and these are very painful for the person because the person has to prove in a court of law what is the pain, the agony that one has gone, what is the deceit that one has undergone, and things like that. Yeah.
So a lot of ladies or a lot of women, I would say, also fear social backlash when it comes to taking that first step of moving out or voicing out that this is the pain that I'm experiencing. So what's your message to those who are suffering in silence and not talking about what they are going through?
There's nothing to be ashamed about. If you are at the receiving end of violence from anybody, don't feel guilty about it, that I have been beaten up or I have been treated this manner. You are not to be feeling guilty about it. He is the perpetrator and you are the sufferer. So the moment you realize that what I'm going through is my pain, but I need to address that, please address. Today, everybody is very empathetic to people who come from such kind of situation. So there's no need for you to hide behind some closed doors or not to talk about it and do it shoo-shoo, no, we don't talk about it. See whatever you can do. See what kind of comfort you can get in terms of professionals and therapists and lawyers and all. And also from support groups which are there who have been also subjected to such similar things. And face the situation with dignity and with conviction that you will get justice.
So Ms. Deshmukh, there's a very common concern a lot of people have asked, and that is why I'm raising this in front of you, that many women have this social fear and a fear of backlash from the society. That if I have suffered for so long and if I take that step to go against the family system where I have been abused and I have been constantly abused, and it's like a regular scenario in the house where गाली पड़ती है, कभी हाथ भी उड़ जाता है या कभी कुछ और insulting situation हो जाती है, and now kids are also used to that kind of culture in the family. आज मैंने एक पहला कदम उठाया तो लोग क्या कहेंगे, दुनिया का क्या कहेगी, और am I worth that first step to be taken for my own self, for my own rights? So what is the message for such women in the society who exist and who still suffer in silence, according to you?
So the answer to this question is, number one is what will be the perception or what would be the optics of the society, or the backlash as the word that you have used. In case a woman, say after a few years of marriage, decides to walk out, would they question her that, listen, it's all rubbish because all these years she never made a hue and cry? Or would they support her? So in my understanding, now the concept is changing. Even the society at large is accepting that it takes a lot of effort for a woman to really stand up for herself and to walk out of the house. So it could be within 2 years of marriage, or it could be after 10 years of marriage also. So they do look at it with a lot of introspection and say that, I'm sure she must have been driven to that point. Or it is so typical in Indian households. Okay, even your own parents tell you, okay, it's okay, just let it go. Just adjust. Let's don't be so things. But something, I must tell you that I see a lot of changes, and I'll give you a little example for this. Earlier when clients used to come, and I'm saying 10, 15 years back, and if a girl was in such a situation, she would be accompanied by a friend or a cousin. And she would say, this is what is happening, and then the parents would never come. And the natural question was, do you have parents and why are they not there? My father and mom don't know about it, because if I tell them that I'm doing this, they will say, what's wrong with you and why you've gone to lawyers and why you're doing this. Today, cut one, cut two, here, when we talk about today, we see a lot of these girls who are troubled or whatever, accompanied by their parents. And they say, my daughter has been telling that she's been going through. Yes, typically as parents, we're telling her, you must adjust. After all, these are all teething problems, etc. But I think what she's now taken a step, we stand by her, we support her, and we want you to give her the relief. I'll give you a very simple, very interesting example. I just concluded that case 2 months back. The daughter-in-law came to me, and her husband was having an affair, and he filed for divorce, and he was asking for that. And guess who came with her? Her mother-in-law.
Oh.
Her mother-in-law came with her, and she told me, very well educated, and the mother-in-law was talking. And first I thought she was the girl's mother, and then she said, ma'am, in case you don't know, my son is the one who has ruined her life. And my husband is a little unwell, so he could not come to your chambers. But my husband and me are supportive of this girl. She's been a lovely girl. She's taken utmost care. You see her, she was a Bengali, very beautiful, very well educated. She's so well placed, and she's been so loving and caring to us. 5 to 6 years of the marriage that she was here, she was more like a daughter. And she was combining her work, and she was doing it. And this son of ours, and we are so ashamed to call him our son, only son, whom we gave him everything on the platter, is now gone, and he's having an affair, and now we want your guidance. We want you to represent her against my son. We will testify against him in a court of law.
Wow, that's so amazing.
And this is what was a turning point. Because when a woman is hurt, a woman stands by her. And that is where we saw the mother-in-law come. And every time she would come to the court or she would come to my chambers, mother-in-law would be there. Then finally, you know how we settled the matter? The house stands in the name of the father and the mother and the husband. It was typically in 3 names.
Yeah.
The husband, we forced him to give that share to his wife. And now the house stands in the name of the father-in-law, mother-in-law, and the ex-daughter-in-law.
Wow.
And the ex-daughter-in-law, I'm calling her because of the legal terms, is now staying with her in-laws, ex-in-laws, and taking care of them.
Amazing.
And this is what life is.
Wow. So amazing.
It is.
It's a rare case.
This is the truth. No, I had one more case like this where that was a Christian couple, and this I'm talking about 10 years back. And a gentleman came, elderly gentleman in his late 70s, and he said that, this girl, Suzanne, they started talking about her and all. And then I didn't realize, I thought he was the father. And then he said, no, it's my son. He has wronged her. He's wronged us. He's wronged the child. He's wronged everybody. Lord will not forgive me if I don't stand by this girl. A true Catholic Christian that he was. Lord will not forgive me if I don't stand by this girl, because she's done nothing. She's been lovely. She's been an angel in our family, a great daughter-in-law, a great wife, a great mother. Why should she suffer? And she was at that point of time not working. Whatever other professional charges, I will take care of it. But please ensure that she gets justice.
Wow.
And please ensure that my little one, the grandchild, gets justice.
Amazing.
And that this man is not left scot-free, because he did something which he's not supposed to do.
Excellent. So we come to the last segment, breaking the mirror segment now, Ms. Deshmukh. So what is that one myth you would like to bust about women's rights in the Indian judicial system?
So the myth that one likes to bust is that, so the perception is that the laws as we speak are very sort of loaded towards women, which is what the law says. But the myth which I want to explode is not what all is in the statute is there in the reality. It's all there in the law books, it's there in the statute. What you really get, and rather you in the sense the woman really gets, is completely, if not completely, is hugely different from what her entitlements are. Because at some point of time, she has to choose between exercising her rights through the legal process and finding peace and moving on in life.
Right.
So when you make that compromise, so whatever lofty and amazing laws which are there, the execution becomes a problem. And then women say, enough is enough. I just want to move on now. So this is the myth.
I think the most important thing people need to understand that even though you have fought legal battles, even if you have divorced, learn to move on in life, learn to move with life, with time. That's something which is very important, because a lot of people get scarred personally
100%.
also with divorces, and they hold on to those scars. They don't move ahead.
And I also believe, instead of languishing in that, the toxicity of the relationship, of the legal system, about how things are going to happen in a court of law, if you can get the first chance of peace, buy it, grab it with both your hands. There is no substitute to peace. And as you rightly said, there's no substitute to moving on in life, even if the initial days are going to be a little, not so smooth, and they're going to have rough patches. But then you have that peace at the end of the day. You have to take your own, pick your own choice.
Absolutely. And I would only like to say one thing here, that, divorces can be peaceful and they can be ugly at the same time.
And graceful.
Yes, peaceful and graceful.
Yes, divorces can be graceful. And I always say that, there are, of course, some extreme cases. There are two good people in not so good marriage. It doesn't make that somebody is black and somebody is white.
True.
We all have shades of grey. There are no two perfect people. Unfortunately, they're not able to gel. Unfortunately, they are not compatible. So why not do it gracefully?
Yes.
Why not do it in a graceful and an amicable manner? Every divorce doesn't have to go to court and you are this and I'm this and have 100 allegations and hundreds of things. Just move on. There's no substitute to peace.
Exit from the relationship for the sake of yourself first, and then for the sake of children if they are involved. Because ultimately, first you suffer, and looking at your suffering, the children also eventually suffer. So ultimately, it's not worth it. It's not worth your time, your energy, and the life that you can lead, a quality life that you can lead. You're just ruining it by, I think, mourning over what's lost and what you could have done. So I think moving ahead, moving
and
on
I
is the
always
best
believe that if
solution.
you have to choose between being right and kind, be kind.
Very true.
So that's the word that's one thing that I would like to say. Be kind to yourself, be kind to the children, be kind to everything, and then move on. Is it the right thing to do? Well, what's right, what's not, one doesn't know.
Absolutely. And I think those were absolute words of wisdom.
Thank you so much.
Ms. Deshmukh, and there was so much to learn from this conversation.
Thank you so much.
For me, for my entire team, I think we actually got to know a lot today. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Pleasure. And thank you for having me over and having this interaction.
Thank you. Thank you
Pleasure.
so much
Thank
for
you.
being a part of
Thank you,
Perception and Beyond.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Today's conversation with Ms. Mrinalini Deshmukh was more than legal insight. It was a roadmap for any woman seeking clarity, confidence, and control over her life. We unpacked everything from legal rights in marriage, financial independence, and domestic abuse law, to inheritance, live-in relationships, and divorce procedures in India. Remember, the law isn't just for the powerful, it's for the informed. And when women know their rights, they no longer live a life of fear, they live with a choice. If this episode helped you, please share it with the women in your life. Let's break the silence around legal awareness for women and spread knowledge where it's needed most. This is Perception and Beyond, where every conversation has the power to inform, uplift, and transform. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned for more eye-opening stories and expert truths.